Chapter 2. Analyzing the Fragility of Civilization. So, why is civilization so fragile? I believe there are several reasons. 1. The vulnerability of life in the face of natural disasters. According to some experts, our current civilization began around 15,000 years ago, following the Great Flood. The previous civilization, however, could not withstand the flood and was almost entirely wiped out, with only a few primitive herders surviving in the high mountains. Therefore, when faced with catastrophic natural disasters, human civilization is often left with little chance of survival. 2. The ruthlessness of barbarism towards civilization. Throughout history, both ancient and modern, there are countless examples of civilizations suffering ruthless destruction and trampling at the hands of barbaric societies. In this kind of conflict, civilizations are often unable to defend themselves due to the savage nature of their enemies, who know no mercy. 3. The fragility of human nature. Human nature itself is fragile. In the face of fear and greed, even the most civilized individuals can quickly turn into savages or become accomplices to barbarism. In today's world, many influential figures in the political, economic, media, and high-tech fields of civilized nations have been bought off and infiltrated by barbaric regimes like the CCP. The dangers of this influence are still not fully recognized by the Westerners, particularly by the United States and its allies. A historical case that profoundly illustrates this point is the downfall of the highly advanced Song dynasty in China. Despite being a remarkably advanced civilization, the Song was repeatedly bullied by the northern nomadic tribes and eventually fell to them. The reasons for the Song's defeat are complex, but human nature played a significant role. The northern tribes were ruthless and warlike, while the Song, by comparison, were much more civilized. They preferred to resolve conflicts through diplomacy whenever possible and were more fearful of bloodshed and death. Additionally, while greed is a common human nature, the northern nomads' greed drove them to greater ambition and risk-taking, while the Song officials' greed led them to sell out their country for personal gain. As a famous history teacher analyzed, Song's failure was determined by two factors, cost and desire, both of which, in my opinion, the northern tribes had in greater measure than the Song. In terms of cost, the northern tribes were self-sufficient, with each warrior equipped with Thyron weapons and horses, and their food consisted of simple dried meat and alcohol. Whenever the tribal leader gave the order, they could immediately assemble their forces, making the cost offer minimal. In contrast, the southern Song had to spend respectable sums of money on recruiting and training an army, so the logistics of warfare were very expensive. The phrase, "before the army moves, provisions must be prepared," aptly describes the Song's difficulties. In terms of desire, the northern tribes lived in arid, cold, and resource-poor regions with a weak economy, which fueled their desire to invade the resource-rich, prosperous southern regions. The Song, on the other hand, had no interest in conquering the barren and cold north. The northern tribes' insatiable desire for wealth, resources, and the beauty from the south led to continuous invasions, which the Great Wall could not stop at all. As a result, despite their higher level of civilization, the Song was destined to lose. Similarly, today's Western democracies, led by the United States, often struggle with dealing with terror groups or authoritarian regimes. The barbaric side is adept at exploiting the goodwill and the empathy of civilized nations, often using deception, infiltration, and theft to gain advantages. This situation is remarkably similar to how the Song thought they could achieve peace by paying tribute to avoid war, but ended up in a disastrous fate. Today, the United States continues to try to use economic engagement, such as helping China develop through Wall Street investments, believing that this will bring about peaceful reform and global progress. However, as history shows, this path will likely end in failure. Politicians in the U.S. need to seriously reflect on their strategies. Additionally, while politicians in democratic nations are generally more civilized and progressive than their authoritarian counterparts, individuals in positions of influence within democratic societies may still misjudge situations or be bought off or infiltrated by those dictatorship regimes. For example, the CCP cloaks itself in a veil of respectability, infiltrates and engages in public relations campaigns to undermine democratic governments. They gradually weaken democratic systems by targeting individual leaders, acquiring confidential information, and stealing advanced technology, even interfering in the election in many democratic countries, all while remaining hidden behind a facade of lies and deception. The reason why the nationalist government lost mainland of China to the CCP was partly due to the extensive infiltration by the CCP within their ranks, which is a profound lesson. Finally, consider the ongoing threat posed by the CCP virus, COVID-19. It's just one of the many dangers lurking beneath the CCP's deceptive veneer. If the United States and other civilized nations do not wake up and take proactive measures, even greater disasters from barbaric regimes are bound to follow. In fact, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin is already escalating violence against the Ukrainian people. Democratic nations must act quickly to provide support and even consider direct military intervention to help defend civilization and contain barbarism. In summary, the fragility of civilization is not only a result of external threats but also the internal vulnerability of human nature, greed, fear, and misguided judgment. As history teaches us, failure to recognize these threats and act decisively will lead to the destruction of civilization. Every year, a large number of people from barbaric and underdeveloped countries migrate to civilized and developed countries. As the number of these immigrants continues to rise, their influence on the host countries grows stronger. Many of these immigrants come from authoritarian regimes and privileged social classes, who, consciously or unconsciously, bring with them the mindset of hierarchy. Moreover, if certain malevolent regimes like CCP covertly manipulate this process, these immigrants may become a fifth column to interfere with democratic elections and subvert democratic systems. Civilized and ruthless countries must be vigilant to prevent this, as it could become a fatal weakness in their fragile civilization. The current immigration policies of Western democratic countries like the United States are largely modeled after the corrupt buying of indulgences practices of the medieval era. The people who truly need help are those suffering oppression and persecution, yet the policies often favor individuals from the political and economic elites. In some ways, these immigration policies inadvertently encourage the immoral actions of corrupt businessmen and officials. No matter how much harm and corruption they be committed, as long as they launder money and invest in immigration, effectively buying a fail-free card, they can escape punishment and enter the so-called civilized world, the supposed paradise. For example, Deng Xiaoping, the head of a conspiracy behind the violent crackdown on the Tiananmen Square protests, has descendants who were able to easily immigrate to the United States. How is this possible? Isn't it? Because they could buy the indulgence. Similarly, many corrupt Chinese, naked officials, and naked businessmen find it relatively easy to immigrate to developed nations. Earlier, I feared that such immigrants, with their barbaric mentalities and corrupt hearts, would struggle to integrate into civilized societies, engaging in various forms of infiltration and destruction. But now, I've come to believe that the so-called civilized countries' immigration policies themselves foster this disorder. If infiltration and destruction occur, it may be the result of their own missteps. Civilized democratic nations, for the sake of their own interests, rarely focus on helping the oppressed people by authoritarian regimes. What a shame. The whole world will share the disasters from barbaric regimes like CCP someday. Furthermore, in the 1970s, while the US was bringing the CCP into the United Nations, why could they have kept Taiwan as the representative of the Republic of China in the UN? Why could North Korea and South Korea coexist, yet Taiwan and the CCP couldn't? What force was behind the USA's repeated goodwill and misplaced optimism toward the CCP? The fragility of civilization is also reflected in the occasional appearance of incompetent and confused teammates or capitulationists within the ruling groups of civilized societies. Given that the United States had over 80 years of slavery history and nearly 100 years of discrimination and unequal treatment toward people of color after the abolition of slavery, I doubt whether the US, especially certain politicians and capitalists, truly opposes authoritarian regimes like the CCP. To them, democracy is beneficial for the masses, but it's hard to govern, and the common people are not easily manipulated. However, if an authoritarian government is willing to open its domestic market and free up its labor force, while not being hostile to the US government, then American politicians are willing to cooperate with those dictators and even provide full support. They might even naively believe that if the whole world becomes democratic, the US would lose its privileged status as the beacon of democracy and its advantages in finance and technology. In many cases, the US plays the role of a temporary policeman in the world. Yet, it continues to have secret dealings with barbaric regimes like CCP, talking endlessly about cooperation and mutual benefits. So, how can the Chinese people, who are suffering under CCP oppression and slavery, truly get democracy and freedom to live a good life? The recent dissatisfaction in the US with the CCP stems from Xi Jinping, who is pushing the country backward, wanting to return to the Mao era or even restore a form of imperialism. On the economic front, Xi only wants to develop state-owned enterprises while pushing private enterprises aside. He also suppresses Hong Kong and threatens Taiwan militarily. Although the US and its allies regularly conduct military exercises in the South China Sea and the Western Pacific, and threaten China with military force, the CCP knows that the US economy, especially its dependence on Chinese-made daily consumer goods, has become too intertwined. As long as CCP does not initiate war, the US will not impose sanctions on China for its internal authoritarianism, surveillance, or violent crackdowns. Even when criticizing China, the US politicians will always carefully choose words to avoid provoking the CCP's fragile nerves. As long as its interests are safe, the US sees no need to interfere in China's internal political system. How absurd! While the US publicly declares that it will not interfere in China's political system, numerous CCP spies and agents, bending and subverting democratic regimes, have already infiltrated key departments in the US and other democratic nations. Civilization's fragility in the face of the cunning barbarism of the CCP is clear. It is as vulnerable as the once mighty Song dynasty, which could not have imagined losing to a backward nomadic tribe. Similarly, if the US continues its arrogant self-confidence, it will one day experience the bitter consequences. If such a historical tragedy were to repeat itself, the world would become darker, and human civilization would regress. Looking at the current situation, the United States, at its peak, will not be able to escape the fate of being overturned if it does not learn from the collapse of the Song dynasty. Therefore, I have a bold prediction. In the near future, Australia or Canada will replace the United States as the world's most advanced and powerful democratic nation. We often say that it's easy to turn bad but hard to stay good, easy to fall ill but hard to maintain good health. Similarly, because the nature of barbarism is to destroy and plunder, while the nature of civilization is to build and create, civilization often appears fragile in the face of barbarism. Despite this, human civilization continues to move forward cautiously and carefully, stumbling along in its difficult journey.